poor elderly man surprises Millionaire with unexpected gesture. When he reveals what he did, everyone is shocked. Michael Turner stood in the vast lobby of the luxurious hotel, the polished marble floors gleaming beneath his well-polished shoes. His gaze swept across the room, scanning the faces of the guests, all seemingly at ease in this glittering world of affluence. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the idle chatter, it was a world he knew all too well. A world of power, of influence, of wealth. Yet, as he observed the crowd, a hollow feeling lingered in his chest, one that no amount of money or status could fill. Michael had it all: billion-dollar deals, sprawling estates, and the kind of recognition most men could only dream of. But there was something missing, something unnameable that gnawed at his soul. His life had become a series of empty gestures, fleeting pleasures, and hollow accomplishments. He was admired, but never truly known. And the emptiness, the loneliness, was something that never quite left him. This evening, Michael had agreed to attend a charity event, partly for the good press it would bring, but mostly because he felt obligated to play the part of the benevolent millionaire. His assistant had suggested he take a human interest approach, show that he cared. But in truth, Michael was just going through the motions, offering his time and money without ever really engaging. It was a performance, nothing more. As the event unfolded, Michael's gaze was drawn to an elderly man sitting on a park bench just outside the ballroom, a figure whose quiet demeanor stood in stark contrast to the loud opulence surrounding him. David, the old man, had come to the event as part of a group of less fortunate individuals invited to enjoy an evening of luxury. His clothes were simple, his shoes worn, but his eyes, those deep, wise eyes, held a quiet understanding of the world that made Michael pause. David seemed completely unaware of the bustling world around him. Instead, he stared into the night sky, his expression peaceful, even content. Michael couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward him, something in his stillness that made the rest of the room seem so shallow. With a sigh, Michael excused himself from his group and made his way toward the bench, unsure of why he was doing it. He had met countless people over the years, but none of them had ever given him this unsettling sense of curiosity. "Hey," Michael said, his voice tentative but carrying the weight of his usual authority. David didn't immediately respond, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. Michael hesitated, then sat beside him on the bench, his discomfort growing. This wasn't part of his usual routine. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this quiet connection, this subtle force that seemed to draw him closer to the stranger in front of him. David finally spoke, his voice soft but steady, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "You know, you look like someone who has everything, yet seems to have nothing at all." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut, but he said nothing in response, unsure of what to say or how to respond. There was something unnerving about this man, something disarmingly perceptive. But at that moment, Michael didn't want to think about it. He didn't want to confront the emptiness that David had so clearly seen in him. "Don't mind me," David continued. "I just have a lot of time to think, and I'm good at noticing things." Michael was about to stand and walk away, but something in David's calm presence made him pause. A strange mix of irritation and intrigue brewed inside him. "What is it that you notice?" David smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to hold more wisdom than any book or lecture Michael had ever experienced. People are too busy to notice the things that matter. They're too wrapped up in what they can buy, what they can own, to see what's right in front of them. For a moment, there was silence between them, and Michael realized something profound. This man, this humble old man, was more in touch with the world than he had ever been. It was as if David was seeing through him, seeing his soul, and Michael felt a wave of discomfort that he couldn't shake. "Maybe you should spend some time thinking about that," David said as though reading his thoughts. Michael wasn't sure what to say, so he stood abruptly, excusing himself. But as he walked back into the hotel, the words from David lingered in his mind, unsettling him. He tried to dismiss them, but the quiet, wise man remained in his thoughts. And somewhere deep inside, Michael knew that he had just encountered someone that that might change him in ways he wasn't ready to admit. The next day, Michael couldn't shake the image of David from his mind. The old man's words had haunted him, his peacefulness in stark contrast to Michael's frantic, relentless drive for success. What was it about David that had drawn him in? And why had he felt such a pull to sit beside him, to listen to him? Michael had spent the entire morning in meetings, hammering out the details of his latest business venture. Yet his thoughts kept drifting back to that brief interaction. He found himself replaying the conversation over and over in his head, trying to make sense of it. He couldn't help but wonder, who was this man really? And what did he mean by the things that matter? It wasn't long before curiosity got the better of him. He decided to return to the park where he had first encountered David, unsure of what he expected to find. He wasn't even sure what he was searching for. Answers, perhaps, or a sense of clarity he hadn't found in years. As he walked through the park, Michael found himself looking for the old man, his heart unexpectedly racing in anticipation. And there he was, sitting on the same bench, looking as calm and composed as ever. David looked up as Michael approached, and this time, there was no hesitation in his eyes. He simply smiled, as if he had been expecting him. "You're back," David said, his voice warm, almost inviting. Michael took a deep breath and sat beside him once again, though this time it felt different. He wasn't just some businessman here to check off a box. He was a man who was starting to question everything he had known, everything he thought he wanted. "I've been thinking about what you said," Michael admitted, his voice more vulnerable than he had intended. "You said I had everything, but nothing at all. I didn't understand it at first, but now I think I do." David turned toward him, his eyes steady and knowing. "What do you think you understand?" Michael paused. His whole life had been about acquiring, achieving, dominating. But now, sitting beside this stranger, it all seemed so empty. "I think I've spent my whole life running after things that don't matter, and I've ignored the things that do." David nodded slowly, as if Michael had finally arrived at the right conclusion. "It's not too late to change," he said simply. "But it's a long road." Michael looked at him, searching for some hint of a joke, but David's expression remained serious. The old man wasn't trying to make him feel better. He wasn't offering empty platitudes. He was offering the hard truth. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Michael couldn't stop thinking about David's words. He had always believed that success was about what you could hold in your hands: money, status, power. But after their brief conversation, a question lingered in his mind. Was that really what mattered? That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned, unable to shake the image of the old man's peaceful face, his quiet wisdom. Michael knew he had to go back, see him again, talk to him. The emptiness that had haunted him for years seemed to be growing, a hollow ache that all the wealth in the world couldn't fill. The next day, he made his way back to the park, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and vulnerability. When he saw David sitting on the same bench, he felt an unexpected wave of relief. There was something about the old man's calm demeanor that made him feel seen. Michael sat down beside him. There was no small talk, no pretenses, just the weight of the moment hanging between them. "I've been thinking about what you said," Michael began, his voice quieter than usual. David didn't immediately respond. He simply waited, as if he knew this moment would come. "I've spent my whole life trying to fill a void, but nothing seems to work. I thought I had it all." But Michael trailed off, his throat tightening. "It's not enough." David looked at him with gentle eyes. "You've been chasing the wrong things, son. True fulfillment doesn't come from what you can buy. It comes from what you can give." Michael sat in silence, the weight of those words settling over him. He had never considered life from that angle. Perhaps David was right. Maybe it was time to stop chasing and start giving. The more Michael thought about David's words, the more they took root. He began re-evaluating his life, not just his business, but his relationships, his purpose. At work, he started prioritizing people over profits, seeking out causes that mattered, not just lucrative deals. One afternoon, he canceled a meeting to spend time with his estranged sister, something he hadn't done in years. David's wisdom became a quiet guide for him, but it wasn't always easy. There were moments when the old temptations of wealth and status called to him. trying to pull him back into his old world. But each time, Michael remembered the peaceful old man sitting on that bench, reminding him that true success was about connection, not accumulation. His journey hadn't been without struggle, but slowly, Michael began to feel a change. His life wasn't about what he could hold in his hands anymore. It was about what he could offer to others. And for the first time, he felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. Weeks passed, and Michael's transformation deepened. He found himself searching for meaning beyond the sleek conference tables and boardroom meetings that had once consumed him. One morning, as he sipped his coffee, a thought struck him. What if he could use his success to create something truly meaningful? The question burned in his chest, the idea of giving back, not as a gesture, but as a way of life. That afternoon, he called his assistant and canceled all meetings for the day. He had something more important to do. Michael headed straight to the community center he had passed countless times but never truly noticed before. It was small, tucked away between apartment buildings with peeling paint and an unkempt lawn. When he walked in, the quiet hum of activity enveloped him. Volunteers sorting donations, children playing in a corner. He felt out of place, the weight of his tailored suit suddenly seeming so foreign here. But then, David's voice echoed in his mind. True fulfillment doesn't come from what you can buy. It comes from what you can give. Michael approached the front desk and introduced himself. The receptionist, a woman with tired eyes but a warm smile, listened as he offered to contribute. Not just money, but his time, his energy. She was taken aback at first, but smiled graciously when she saw the sincerity in his eyes. As Michael left, he felt a strange lightness in his chest, as though something inside him had shifted. He had begun to realize that the real value in life wasn't found in the things he had accumulated, but in what he could do for others. And for the first time in years, he felt the true sense of purpose he had been searching for. The following week, Michael returned to the community center, this time with a different mindset. He didn't wear his expensive suit. He wore a simple shirt and jeans, blending in with the volunteers. He spent hours helping to organize events for underprivileged children, something he never would have done before. It was hard work, physically exhausting, but Michael didn't mind. Each moment of sweat, each smile from the children, felt like a small victory. He had never experienced anything quite like it. The sense of connection, of being part of something bigger than himself. One afternoon, as he was cleaning up after an event, a little girl approached him, her eyes bright with excitement. She handed him a small, crumpled drawing she had made, a stick figure of a man with a smile, holding a heart. "Thank you," she said shyly. "You're helping us?" Michael was taken aback by her sincerity. He had helped countless people in his business life, but this was different. The simple, unspoken gratitude in her eyes made something inside him break open. It wasn't the money he gave or even the time, it was the presence, the willingness to show up for others without expecting anything in return. That was the true gift. As he stared at the drawing, Michael felt his chest tighten. This small, humble gesture meant more to him than all the awards, all the achievements. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen, and for the first time in a long time, he understood the true meaning of giving. As the weeks unfolded, Michael found himself at a crossroads. The quiet moments of reflection, the time spent with David and at the community center, had stirred something deep within him. The world he had once lived in, a world of endless meetings, luxury cars, and extravagant dinners, seemed so far away now. One evening, after a particularly long day volunteering, Michael sat alone in his apartment, his mind racing. The city lights outside seemed to mock him with their cold, indifferent glow. He stared at his reflection in the glass, wondering how he had gotten so lost. How had he allowed himself to believe that success was defined by wealth, by the things he owned? David's words echoed in his mind. True fulfillment doesn't come from what you can buy. It comes from what you can give. Michael clenched his fists, his chest tightening with frustration. But what do I have to give? He thought. The emptiness that once filled his life with ambition now felt like a cavern. His career was built on transactions, not on relationships. The people he had once called friends were either distant or shallow. What did he have to offer the world, other than his wealth? Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his sister, Sarah, someone he hadn't spoken to in over a year. The message was simple: "I miss you. Can we talk soon?" For a long moment, Michael simply stared at the screen. His heart ached. The distance between them had always been his own doing, his inability to make time for her, for family. He had prioritized everything else over his relationships, thinking that success would bridge the gap. And now, it had become a chasm. With a deep breath, Michael typed a reply, "Yes. Let's talk tomorrow. I'd like that." As he put down his phone, he felt a small shift. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A first step toward mending the ties he had broken, toward rediscovering the connections that truly mattered. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. The journey to rediscovering himself had begun. The following afternoon, Michael arrived at the cafe where he had arranged to meet Sarah. He was early, which felt foreign to him. In his old life, punctuality was merely about business. Now, it felt like a small act of respect, a way to show he valued this meeting, this moment. When Sarah walked in, Michael could see the hesitation in her eyes. The years of silence between them hung thick in the air. She had always been the more reserved of the two, but the hurt in her eyes was unmistakable. "Hi, Mike," she said quietly, taking a seat across from him. "Hey, Sarah," he replied, his voice softer than he expected. "I'm sorry. For everything. For not being there. For the distance." Her gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. The words were out there now, hanging between them. Michael had always been so good at running from difficult conversations, but not this time. This time, he had nothing to hide. "I know I've been a terrible brother," Michael continued, the weight of the truth pressing on his chest. "I thought success would make up for everything, but I was wrong." Sarah's eyes finally met his, and there was a flicker of something, anger, sadness, but also something softer. "Hope, perhaps. I don't know if I can just forget all of it," she said, her voice cracking. "But I'm glad you're here, Mike. I missed you." Michael felt a lump form in his throat. The distance wasn't something that could be bridged in a single conversation. But this moment, this raw honesty, was a step forward. And for the first time, Michael realized that success wasn't about earning money or praise. It was about these moments, these small, fleeting connections that defined who you really were. The following days were filled with quiet contemplation for Michael. His meeting with Sarah had stirred something deep inside him, an understanding that the years of self-imposed isolation had cost him far more than he had ever realized. The ache he had felt in his chest wasn't from the loss of money or accolades. It was the ache of lost time, of broken bonds that couldn't be easily repaired. He spent hours replaying their conversation, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. He had convinced himself that his work, his ambition, was enough. But now, in the quiet aftermath, he understood that it had never been enough. No success, no fortune could fill the empty space where his family should have been. That night, Michael stood at the window of his apartment, staring out at the city. The lights below twinkled like distant stars, beautiful and cold. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through the contacts. He stopped at David's name and paused. There was so much he wanted to ask him, to share with him, but he wasn't sure if he had the right words. With a sigh, he pressed the dial button. The phone rang a few times before David answered, his voice calm, as always. "Michael," David said warmly. "How are you?" "I don't know," Michael replied, his voice cracking. "I'm struggling, David. I thought I knew what mattered, but now everything feels empty. I've spent so many years chasing the wrong things." There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment, Michael thought David might have hung up. But then he spoke, his words measured, but with a wisdom that felt like a lifeline. "You're waking up, Michael," David said gently. "That's the first step. It's never easy. But remember, the past is just that, the past. What matters now is what you do with the time you have left. What matters now is who you choose to be." Michael felt a tear slip down his cheek. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words. It wasn't too late to change. It wasn't too late to heal. For the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to feel vulnerable, to let go of the walls he had built around himself. And in that vulnerability, he began to find the strength to rebuild both his life and his relationships. A few days after his conversation with David, Michael found himself standing in front of the community center once again, the place that had become a symbol of his transformation. He had volunteered there countless times, but today felt different. Today, he was ready to take the next step, to give more than just his time. As he walked in, he was greeted by familiar faces, people who had become more than just acquaintances. They had become his community. The warmth in their smiles made his heart ache with a bittersweet longing. He had been blind to this world for so long, focused only on his own ambitions, never realizing how much he was missing. He approached the desk, where a volunteer was helping a family sign up for a food pantry. Michael paused, feeling the weight of his decision. "I'd like to make a donation," he said softly. The volunteer smiled politely, but Michael could see the surprise in her eyes. "That's very generous of you, sir." Michael shook his head. "It's not just money. I want to do more. I want to help create opportunities for the children here. They deserve more than what this world has given them." Her eyes softened, and she nodded. "We love that. You have a lot to offer, Michael. It's not just about the money. It's about your time, your heart." The words struck him deeply. It wasn't just about the donation. It was about showing up, being present in the lives of others. It was about the gift of attention, the gift of care, the gift of truly seeing people for who they were. Michael left the center that day with a new sense of purpose, a purpose that had nothing to do with his wealth and everything to do with his heart. As he walked back to his car, he smiled to himself. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path, a path that led to connection, to love, and to the understanding that true fulfillment comes from giving, not taking. The weeks following Michael's visit to the community center brought a quiet transformation. The rush of business meetings, the clinking of glasses in high-end restaurants, and the whirlwind of his former life seemed like distant echoes. Michael found himself waking up earlier, not to check his stock portfolio, but to volunteer, to spend time with the children he had grown to care for, and to reflect on what he had lost and, more importantly, what he could still gain. One afternoon, after a long day of organizing a youth event, Michael sat on the steps of the center, watching the children play in the yard. Their laughter was contagious, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt a profound peace. These kids, with their energy and innocence, had something he had lost: hope. They weren't weighed down by the expectations of the world around them. They were simply present, enjoying the moment. As he sat there, a small boy approached him, holding out a brightly colored bracelet. His face was innocent, his eyes wide with trust. "Here, mister," the boy said. "For you?" Michael looked at the bracelet in his hand, a simple woven piece of string with a few beads. But the gesture carried more weight than any expensive gift he had ever received. It was a gift of acceptance, of connection. The boy didn't care who Michael was or what he had. He simply saw him as another person worthy of kindness. "Thank you," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for reminding me." As the boy ran off to join his friends, Michael felt the rush of gratitude surge within him. In that moment, he understood true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or luxury. It was measured in the ability to love, to connect, and to give. The bracelet wasn't just a token. It was a symbol of the shift that had begun in him, a reminder that the most meaningful gifts were always free. As Michael continued to build his life around this new sense of purpose, his old world seemed to pull at him from afar. Business deals still needed his attention. His company was growing, and with that growth came the pressure to perform, to expand. He had worked tirelessly to get to this point, and now, with his newfound understanding of what truly mattered, he was being forced to make a decision. One evening, as he prepared for yet another gala, he stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tuxedo. The familiar reflection stared back at him, a man he no longer recognized. This version of himself, polished and successful, was still a stranger to the person he was becoming. The wealth, the status, it all felt hollow now, like a mask he had worn for far too long. The phone rang, shattering the silence. It was a call from his assistant, reminding him of the gala. But today, Michael wasn't sure if he wanted to go. "What's wrong, sir?" his assistant asked, sensing his hesitation. I'm not sure this is what I want anymore, Michael said, his voice surprisingly steady. I've been chasing something that doesn't bring me peace. I've been chasing something that doesn't feel real. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the assistant replied softly, "You've always had the power to choose, Mr. Carrington. Maybe now is the time to decide what kind of life you truly want." The words hit Michael like a thunderclap. What kind of life do I truly want? The answer was slowly becoming clear. He didn't want the world he had built with money and power. He wanted a world where he could make a difference, where he could contribute, where he could be loved, not for his wealth, but for who he was. With a sigh, Michael hung up the phone. He made the decision. No gala, no business meetings. Instead, he was going to spend the night with the children at the community center. He needed to be there, needed to see the impact of his choices, to remember what truly mattered. As he left his apartment, the weight of the decision felt heavy, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be real. It would be his. And that at last was enough. Michael arrived at the community center just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the playground. The familiar sounds of children's laughter filled the air, but today, there was an added weight in his chest. For the first time, he wasn't just visiting as a volunteer. He was here to face his own reality. He needed to confront the decisions he had been avoiding. He found David by the old basketball court, coaching a small group of boys who were practicing their shots. Michael stood in the doorway, watching for a moment, and David looked up, catching his gaze. There was no surprise, no judgment, just an understanding. "Everything okay, Mike?" David asked, wiping the sweat from his forehead. His voice was kind, but Michael could sense the quiet concern beneath it. "I don't know," Michael admitted, his throat tight. "I've been thinking a lot. About my life, about everything I've been doing. I've been so focused on what I could have, what I could gain. I forgot what really matters." David nodded, his eyes softening. "You're not the only one. It's easy to get caught in that trap. But the fact that you're here, that you're facing it, well, that's already a big step." Michael walked closer, watching the children as they laughed, their faces glowing with innocence and joy. The simplicity of it all struck him hard. "I've spent my life looking for validation in all the wrong places. I've been running from the things that matter most, my family, real connections. I miss so much." David's expression grew serious. "It's not too late, Mike. It may take time, but it's never too late to start making the right choices. You're not alone in this. We all make mistakes. The important thing is what you do with the lessons." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat, but he pushed it down. He had always prided himself on his ability to fix problems, to take charge. But now, he understood that the real work was internal. It wasn't about fixing things externally. It was about healing what was broken inside. The weight of his own emotions was overwhelming, but David's words were a lifeline. The guilt, the regret, it was all part of the process. It wasn't easy, but he was ready to face it. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty and a mixture of emotions. Michael's decision to step away from his high-profile business life and focus on something more meaningful was daunting. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the leap would change everything, but uncertain of what would be waiting on the other side. He continued to volunteer at the center, spending more time with the children and their families. It wasn't easy, though. The pull of his old life was always there, like a shadow that never quite left. Every time his phone rang with another business opportunity or invitation to an elite event, he felt a tug in his chest. One evening, as he walked through the center's hallways, his phone rang again. It was his attorney. The sound of the ringtone felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him. He stared at the screen, then reluctantly answered. "Michael, I just wanted to check in. You've been making some changes, and I wanted to remind you about the upcoming merger meeting. It's a big deal. Your presence is essential." Michael's heart sank. The words essential echoed in his mind, the weight of them pressing down on him. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a turning point, a chance to solidify his position, to assert his power. But as the words hung in the air, Michael realized something. He didn't want it anymore. He didn't need it. "Thanks," he said quietly, "but I won't be attending. I've made my decision. The silence on the other end of the phone was thick, and for a moment, Michael thought his lawyer might protest. But then, the voice on the other end simply sighed. "Okay, Michael, if that's what you want." Michael hung up and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. A strange sense of relief washed over him. The fear, the anxiety, everything about his old life seemed to slip away, leaving room for something new, something more real. He turned to face the playground once again, watching the children as they ran and played under the fading light of the day. There was peace here, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The fear of change, of the unknown, still lingered, but it was now accompanied by a quiet hope, a belief that the future could be something far greater than he had ever imagined. For the first time, Michael didn't feel the need to prove anything. He didn't need the approval of others. He didn't need to chase success. What mattered now was being present, being true to himself, and giving back to the world that had given him so much. The morning after the phone call, Michael sat by the window, staring out at the busy city streets below. For the first time, he felt disconnected from the chaos that had once defined his life. The cars honked, the people rushed by, but it all felt distant, irrelevant, almost foreign to him now. The noise was deafening, but his mind was quiet for once. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about what lay ahead. His decision to step away from the corporate world wasn't something he could take back, but it was something he had chosen with his whole heart. There was no turning back now, no second-guessing. The weight of his decision was still heavy, but there was a certain relief in it. The fear that had gripped him for weeks, the fear of losing everything, was slowly starting to fade. And in its place was a small but growing sense of purpose. He needed to make real changes. This was just the beginning. Michael grabbed his coat and left his apartment, not knowing what the day would bring, but determined to face it with a clear mind. As he walked down the familiar streets of the city, he couldn't help but notice the differences in how he saw the world now. The glass buildings, the polished cars, the power lunches, they no longer held the allure they once did. Instead, his mind returned to the community center, to the kids he had spent so many afternoons with. There was something there that had started to fill the emptiness that had followed him for years. He arrived at the center and walked straight into the office, where David was organizing some files. "Hey, David," Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot. I want to do more. I want to help more." David looked up from his desk, a smile spreading across his face. "I knew you were going to say that." Michael chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It felt good to say the words out loud. "I've been running away from the things that matter, but I can't do that anymore. I want to help create real change. For these kids, for this community." David stood up, walking over to Michael. "You're already making a difference. But if you're serious about this, we can always use more hands, more heart." For the first time, Michael felt a deep connection to what they were building here. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. This was the life he wanted. It was messy, unpredictable, but it was his. The next few days were a blur of activity, but something was missing. Even as Michael threw himself into his work at the center, a lingering doubt gnawed at him. He hadn't fully confronted his past, the things he had left behind in order to start fresh. There were still pieces of his old life that had to be put to rest. He couldn't move forward without confronting the wreckage he had left behind. His relationships, the family he had neglected, the mistakes that had defined so much of his earlier years. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something he was looking forward to, but he knew it had to happen. One evening, after a long day of organizing a charity event at the center, Michael sat in his car outside his parents' house. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, his heart pounding. It had been years since he'd last visited them. The guilt that had driven him away felt like a weight he could never fully shake off. With a deep breath, he got out of the car and walked up to the front door. His mother answered, her face softening when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Michael wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure he even deserved to be there. "I've missed you, Michael," his mother said, her voice trembling slightly. "We've missed you. I've missed you too," Michael replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, Mom. I've been a fool." His mother reached out and pulled him into an embrace. And for the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to feel something he had been pushing away for so long: love. Not the kind of love he had sought through success or wealth, but the kind that had always been waiting for him. The kind that healed. As they sat down together, Michael realized how much he had been running. From his past, from his family, from himself. But it was time to stop. Time to rebuild. Time to make amends. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. For the first time in a long while, Michael felt a spark of hope. The journey of healing was just beginning. Michael left his parents' house that evening with a heavy heart, but a sense of quiet peace. The conversation with his mother had opened a door he had long kept shut. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding inside: regret, anger, confusion. But sitting there with her, hearing her words of forgiveness, it was like a weight had lifted, if only a little. On the drive back to the community center, his mind replayed the words he had said to his mother, the way her eyes had softened when he apologized. He realized how much he had missed, how much he had ignored for the sake of ambition, for the false pursuit of success. He had spent so many years thinking he had to prove something to the world, but in doing so, he had lost sight of the very people who had loved him from the start. When he arrived at the center, David was waiting for him, as usual, with a smile that seemed to lift the last of Michael's tension. But today, Michael didn't want to hide behind pleasantries. He needed to share, needed to let someone else know about the steps he was taking to heal. "I want to see my mom today," Michael said as he sat down beside David. I don't know if I've ever really apologized to her. For everything. I've been so caught up in my own mess, in trying to prove something. But I finally realized how much damage I've caused." David listened quietly, his expression calm, but empathetic. "You've taken the first step, Mike. The hardest one?" Michael nodded, his voice tight. "I feel like I've been carrying around this burden for so long, like I've been running away from my own mistakes. I need to do better, not just for myself, but for the people who've always been there." David placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, the gesture simple, but full of support. "We all make mistakes. The question isn't whether you've made them. It's what you do afterward. And I can see you're making the right choices now." Michael stared out the window, the weight of his past still there, but somehow more manageable now. "I think it's time I start forgiving myself, too." The next few weeks were a blur of activity at the center. Michael threw himself into the work, organizing more events, reaching out to local businesses for donations, helping the children with their projects. It felt good to be busy, but it wasn't just the tasks that kept him going. It was the faces he saw every day, the families, the children, David. All of them had become a part of the new life he was building. Despite the progress, there was still one lingering question in his mind. Could he truly change? Could he leave behind a man he had been for so long and become someone new? He had come so far. He had apologized to his family, started rebuilding relationships, and poured his heart into the community center. But every now and then, doubt would creep in. What if it was all temporary? What if deep down he was still the same person he had been before? The man who couldn't see beyond his own desires. The man who had chased power and wealth to fill an empty space inside of him. One evening, after a long day of organizing a charity auction, Michael found himself alone in the center's office, staring at a stack of papers. He rubbed his eyes, exhausted both mentally and physically, when David walked in. "You okay?" David asked, noticing the weariness in his eyes. Michael leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "I'm trying, but there are days when it feels like the past is just waiting to catch up with me. Like I'm not really changing at all." David sat across from him, folding his arms. "You're still here, right? You're still doing the work, still giving. That's what matters. Change isn't always a big moment. It's a series of small steps." Michael looked at David, a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty in his eyes. "I want to believe that. I do. But sometimes, I wonder if it's enough." David smiled softly. "You've already started something bigger than you can see. You're not just changing your life. You're changing theirs too." Michael's gaze fell to the papers in front of him, his heart beating a little faster. Maybe he wasn't perfect. Maybe the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But he was on the right path now. It was a path built on real connections, on giving rather than taking. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly making a difference. not just in the lives of others, but in his own. For the first time, Michael wasn't afraid to hope. Weeks passed, and Michael continued to immerse himself in his new life. He had made progress, but as he neared the final stages of the charity event he had been organizing, a creeping doubt started to return. There was one final test, the gala. The event would be a turning point, both for the community center and for him personally. His reputation, the one he had tried to build in the corporate world, would be put to the test here. As he worked late into the night preparing the final details, the weight of the decision that loomed ahead began to feel heavier than ever. He had already sacrificed so much, but now, the question that had been haunting him for weeks resurfaced. Was he really ready to let go of everything he had built in the past? Was he really prepared to make a true commitment to his new life? The gala would be attended by some of the most influential people in the city. The kind of people Michael had once idolized, the ones he had fought so hard to impress. Yet, here he was no longer seeking their approval. The thought unsettled him, and he couldn't shake the idea that no matter how much he tried to change, his past would always be there, lurking in the shadows. David could see the conflict in Michael's eyes. He approached him quietly, noticing the tension in his posture. "You okay?" David asked, leaning against the doorframe. Michael exhaled slowly, glancing up at him. "I don't know if I am," he admitted. "I've been pretending like I've got everything together, but deep down, I'm still scared. I'm scared I'm not good enough, that I'm not actually capable of changing." David's expression softened. "We all have that fear, but you've already done something that most people can't do. You've faced your mistakes. You've started fresh. That takes more courage than any boardroom decision ever will." Michael looked down at the paperwork in front of him, the weight of his fears sinking in. But this time, instead of running from it, he allowed himself to feel it. And with that, he made a choice. He wasn't going to let his past dictate his future anymore. The night of the gala arrived, and Michael stood in front of the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was full of people in sharp suits and dazzling dresses, a world that felt both familiar and foreign. He had spent his whole life striving for this kind of validation, but now, all he could think about was the reason he was standing here. The children, the families, the community he had come to care about deeply. As he took the microphone, he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The nervousness was still there, but beneath it was something stronger. Purpose. "I've spent most of my life running from who I was," he began, his voice steady but filled with raw honesty. "I thought success was defined by how much you can accumulate, how far you can climb. But I've learned that true success is in what you give, not what you take. It's in the lives you touch, the people you uplift." His words resonated through the room, echoing the journey he had been on. The people in the audience, many of whom had been there for the wrong reasons, started to listen, truly listen. "I'm here tonight not as a businessman, but as someone who believes in the power of community. I've made mistakes. I've hurt people, but it's never too late to change, to make things right." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of people he once thought of as rivals. "And it's never too late to be the person you were meant to be." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the room erupted into applause. Not the kind of applause he was used to, not the shallow kind that came from a successful deal or a closed contract. This was different. This was real. As he stepped off the stage, Michael felt a surge of emotion. For the first time in years, he felt whole. He hadn't just helped raise money for the community center, he had made peace with himself. He had found a new purpose, one that wasn't defined by wealth or status, but by love, compassion, and the chance to build something lasting. David, standing at the back of the room, watched him with a proud smile on his face. The journey wasn't over, but Michael had taken the ultimate step forward. He had finally let go of the person he once was and embraced the man he was meant to become. And in that moment, Michael knew something profound. He had finally found the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Not one of luxury or fame, but one of genuine impact, of real change. And that, he realized, was more valuable than anything he could have ever imagined. The world may not have known it yet, but Michael had already begun to change it. In the end, Michael's journey reminds us that no matter how far we've strayed, it's never too late to change. True success isn't found in wealth or status. It's in the lives we touch and the people we uplift. We all have the power to rewrite our story, to turn regret into redemption, and to build a legacy that's worth more than anything money can buy. If Michael's story moved you, if you believe that change is possible for anyone, share this message. Like if you've ever had to fight your own battles, and comment to let us know how you're making your own transformation. Subscribe for more stories of hope, because the journey to a better you starts here. Don't wait. Your story is waiting to be written.